Hi, welcome to Finding the Funds, Rails to Trails Conservancy's State Legislative Policy Webinar. I'm Leeann Sinpatanasakul. I'm the Advocacy Manager here at RTC, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us. We have here with us Mayor Alex Bieri of Clifton, Ohio, and he's been the mayor for 8 years. And we have two legislative aides joining us from Ohio State Representative Rick Perales' office. We have, from left to right, we have Ben James, and he's been working at the State House for 7 years. And next to him, we have Kevin Livingston, who's been working in the State House for 4 years. And next to him, we have Brian Housh, who is our Midwest Policy Manager at RTC. He is also the Village Council President of Yellow Springs, Ohio, and he's here today in that capacity as well. And here in the office with me in DC is my colleague Andrew Dupuy. He's our Manager of Policy Outreach, and before coming to RTC, he worked in the Texas State Legislature for 8 years. So we have a plethora of state policy experience with us today. I also want to thank Brian for inviting our guest speakers to be here with us today. My colleague Drew for helping to organize, and to Sona Babayan, Matt Horn, and Joseph Nickel. They're our interns, and they're manning the camera behind the scenes, and they'll be monitoring your questions, which you can ask throughout the webinar. So feel free to start typing your questions into the chat box, and we'll have time at the end to start going through some of that. And they can answer your technical questions as well if you're having trouble with anything. So today we'll hear from our distinguished panel of local elected officials, state legislative staff, about what we can expect from state legislatures this year. And mostly we'll be doing case studies of successful policy and funding initiatives mostly from Ohio and also from other states across the country. As you may have noticed, our panel is primarily based in Ohio, and we'll be taking a look at the multiple different successes that have happened in that state and how they sort of complement each other and build off of each other and really sort of snowball into success after success after success. And hopefully you can take some of those lessons away with you to start building up a success after success after success in your state as well, and then use them on whatever trail project you're working on. So I think that's enough from me. Let's turn to the panelists, and we'll have time for questions at the end, and you can submit them into the chat box at any time. But let's just get started. So my first question is for Drew. And I wanted to ask you, what can you tell us about state legislative sessions this year, what we can expect to see for active transportation policy?
Oh, well, thanks, Leeann. Well, the first thing to know is that legislative calendars vary wildly through the state. Ohio, we have guests from a pretty year-round legislature. Other legislatures only meet for a couple of months a year, and some, in fact, only meet every other year. But this time of year, this sort of late winter, early spring period is the time that pretty much all the states are going to be in session. I'd say probably like February to April is the time that we're going to see almost all 50 states at once in session. So this is really the time to be looking at state legislatures and see what kind of policies are coming out of them, where there might be some opportunities to fund active transportation, and also to watch out for some threats that might be coming down the pike. In terms of this year, there was a lot of political changes in last year's midterm elections in terms of the partisan composition of state legislatures. 7 legislative chambers changed, at least 7 chambers changed hands, and then also about 7 governors' seats flipped parties, and that doesn't even account for where a new governor might have succeeded a previous governor of the same party. There's a lot of new leadership in place. There's some new partisan control, or even when the control didn't shift, maybe the percentages might have changed a little bit to create some new dynamics. So I'd encourage advocates to go out and meet with the new leadership and speakers and governors, your administrations, and really convey your priorities and let them know that this is something that's important to their constituents, so that as they start to develop their new agendas for their administrations, legislative sessions, that they consider your point of view. One thing that I think has been a factor for the last few years is gas tax changes to the gas tax. We've seen the federal gas tax stuck at the same level since the early 1990s. So a lot of states, and this is Democrats and Republican states, liberal and conservative states, have taken it upon themselves to increase their gas tax or other ways of increasing transportation revenue. Since 2012, I think a majority of states have attempted to do so. And so that can be beneficial to active transportation if you're in a state where you can use gas tax revenue for bike ped and transit and other modes. Some states have a restriction on using gas tax and transportation revenue for bicycling, for walking, for transit. Other states are very permissive about this. So before you get involved with a gas tax, for example, you want to look if your state considers bike ped funds eligible for those. So we're going to talk a lot in the next few minutes about Ohio, but at the end there will be ample opportunity to talk about other states and other opportunities that you're watching. We'd love to hear from those, from everybody, and discuss those and maybe give some feedback and ideas.
Great. Thanks so much for starting us off, Drew. So I'd like to turn to our main panel, Mr. Bieri, and start off with a local example and a local success of trails. And Mayor Bieri, I understand that you have recently become involved in building a trail in Clifton, Ohio. It's the Yellow Springs Clifton Connector Trail, and it's had some successes over the past couple years. So can you tell us a little about what the project is and how you came to be involved in that?
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. And you're right that we have had some early success. We still have a ways to go. The project is a connector spur off of the Little Miami Trail. Little Miami Trail is the crown jewel in the area for Rails to Trails program. And this connector spur connects a couple of public parks and amenities that are otherwise inaccessible by bicycle or other non-motorized modes of transportation. I got into the project just looking at folks in the rural area outside of Clifton using the roadways, which are really inadequate for that type of transportation. And I'm not personally an avid cyclist, but I am a proponent of models of development that don't include turn lanes and surface parking and are built at the scale of the human. And I think it's really important that we connect our parks, our central business districts, and our neighborhoods in ways that people can access at the scale, the human scale, and not be reliant on the automobile. And so I got into the project looking at it from that perspective as far as the prevailing development model. And I got really excited about the project when I realized that we had overlapping jurisdictions in the township, the neighboring village of Yellow Springs, and even at the state level, where there is a lot of interest in active transportation, and something I didn't realize. And as I got deeper into it, that really helped build a lot of momentum. So we are currently engaged with a design firm that is working on the feasibility study, which includes designing and engineering. And we're applying for a first round of grant funding actually this week.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's great to hear. So, I understand that this was new for you. This was something you hadn't done before. And it's encouraging, I think, to hear that anyone can jump in and start working on a trail project and make it succeed. And we have a number of participants on the webinar, attendees who would either like to build a trail or are in the process of building a trail in their community. So as somebody who is new to the process, but now has some experience to share, what advice would you give to an advocate who's looking to build a local trail? And how would you suggest that that person approach a local elected official such as yourself, and how would they gain support from a local elected official, which I think can sometimes be a little intimidating?
Sure. Sure. And yeah, we always say that public meetings are intimidating for just the lay person and members of the public that aren't perhaps ready to get in front of an audience and stand up to a podium and start spitballing ideas. But what I wouldn't recommend, if there is a non-governmental body, maybe it's a smaller nonprofit, or maybe it's just a citizen organized group, if they have an idea, I don't recommend that they do, say, too much homework and bring a semi-finished proposal, because there's so many moving parts to something like a trail, and so many different aspects that need to be looked at and studied from an engineering perspective, from environmental impacts. The trail that we're working on has environmental easements imposed on quite a bit of the land that's going to be bordering this trail. And those are very technical and complicated things that a lot of lay people don't have access to and aren't exposed to. So what I would encourage people that just want to get started is really begin at the beginning, at the grassroots level, of opening a dialogue and getting a discussion group going. So that may be, as far as approaching your local leaders, it may be finding some common ground if they're attending a meeting or a talk, or there's a session where it would be apropos to just start with bringing up the idea that this trail, that the trail that you have in mind is something that where there are shared interests that perhaps dovetail with some of the interests of the local leaders, and get a discussion going. And once that discussion builds some momentum, then I think you can start to interject a lot more of the technical aspects. But I would just stress that people don't plan it out too much conceptually before they get that dialogue going. It's something that I learned early on, was that everything is fluid, in motion. It's subject to change. The designing and the engineering is a long process that unfolds, rather slowly, and something that people need to be aware of when they start talking about trails, especially when we're talking about connector trails and spurs that are not a straightforward process of paving a vacated rail bed. You've got a lot of different stakeholders involved, and each one of those has separate challenges.
Yes, of course. I think that's great advice for anyone who wants to build a trail and to start a group. Thanks so much for sharing that. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about the project, or about funding, and what kind of funding you've been able to get so far in terms of maybe design or engineering of the project?
Sure. Well, again, I would stress, as a small town mayor in Ohio, none of this is something I could do on my own or with our village council. So I would stress, again, building coalitions with overlapping, jurisdictions. And in my case, it's the neighboring village of Yellow Springs and their local government, and it's the unincorporated township between the two villages. Getting all those players at the table is very important. If we had started planning on our end and then brought it to the other governmental body as a proposal, I don't think we would have got nearly the response we did. As opposed to the way we did it, which was starting the dialogue and sitting down to really build an alliance between the various jurisdictions. So that's been really important, and that was really where our fundraising began. We got some local funds raised at the village level, and then we had a small community grant thrown in, And then once we had that seed money started, we were able to then leverage that for some state capital funds. And none of that, again, would have happened on its own if we hadn't started, spinning that flywheel slowly and building that coalition across the jurisdictions. So the only thing I can say about funding, and we've got a long ways to go, and I know the local matches are often daunting. Something that we're looking at are in-kind matches, which are very common depending on the grant. But donations of materials and time and labor are common, and we are exploring those options rather creatively, because I think that is a strength that small communities often have and don't realize. Whether they have a maintenance crew or whether they have a public works department, often they can leverage a lot of that work that's going to need to be done anyway in clearing and preparing for the construction and so on. So that's something that we're exploring now, and there's a lot of moving parts, and I'd say perhaps Brian has something to add about the funding aspect, but that's definitely very key.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I was going to say.
You want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll just mention that, as Alex pointed out, we've had a nice funding mix so far, but one of the things that we're working on now is we have a county parks and trails levy. We also plan to go to our county commissioners to support this project. They've done that in the past. And, beyond the mix of federal, state, and local funding, thinking about that private funding, Alex mentioned the Yellow Springs Community Foundation, but, we've also got to look at how we're going to, fill in those different layers. The other thing I'll just throw in related to in-kind matches, remember donations of land can be a part of that, volunteer time. Also, we have to fill in a ravine, so aggregate, we're looking for somebody to donate and add that to the in-kind list. So it's a tricky mix, but we're optimistic.
Great. I think that's a wonderful can-do attitude. And so I thank you so much for sharing your experience, Mayor. I think that's definitely helpful. And as I understand it, this project also has some assistance from your Ohio State Representative, Mr. Rick Perales. And obviously here with us, we have his legislative staff. So Kevin and Ben, could you tell us more about Representative Perales' involvement in the Yellow Springs Clifton Connector Trail project, and what is sort of that interplay and relationship like between local and state elected officials?
Yeah, I think the mayor hit the nail right on the head, where a lot of it was just talking with us about it. I'm based in Columbus most of the week, and the representative's the one in the district. So us and the legislative staff, we only get what we hear from either the district or the representative relaying a message. So I think the biggest piece of advice I can give for that is just talk to your representatives about it, talk to your local legislators about it. Otherwise, we and the staff would have had no idea that there was a project that needed funding. So when the capital budget comes up here in Ohio, it's done in the even number of years of the General Assembly, so after our operating budget, which we're about to dive into actually in the coming months. But when we're looking for capital funds to distribute around the state to make sure that we can work on projects, whether it be parks, trails, refurbishing theater houses, beefing up some educational programs, anything that can fall into that capital designation is stuff that we look at. So the representative held some local office hours, and the mayor and his team came in and talked to us about the trail and said, hey, this is what we're trying to do. This is what it's going to cost us. This is what the financial support that we're looking at from the state. So we took that to our budget director. We took it to finance. And while they were crafting the budget, we were able to say, hey, Yellow Springs Clifton Connector Trail, it's a no-brainer, straightforward project. We're just trying to make sure that we can get people access to the Miami Valley Trail, make sure that they can, experience what we have to offer here in the Miami Valley. And as far as dollar amounts went, it wasn't a high dollar amount, which was wonderful, because a lot of times people have to sit there and say, well, here's what we need, but here's what we can live with. Whereas how this budget request went, it was straightforward. It said, hey, we just need a little bit to get going, get rolling. And a lot of that was the representative talking with some of his colleagues, talking with the Senate, making sure that we could choreograph that request with our local senator as well. And once we all put it in writing, we just made sure it was good to go, making sure people were on board and supporting us. After that, it was smooth sailing. So none of that wouldn't happen if we hadn't had that initial meeting, because we never would have known about it. But once the representatives are aware of it and the senators are aware of it, we'll fight for our districts. We'll make sure that we can do, especially no-brainer projects like this. This was a straightforward, easy to do, and for us it was relatively smooth sailing.
Wonderful. And so when advocates come to you and they ask for these budget requests, what sort of information should they be sharing with staff such as yourself? What sort of helps make the case for why this is important, and what's something that would convince you or help you understand why it's important to them?
A big part of that would be, I would say it's the 5 W's, the who, what, where, why, and how, and that last H in there. Just giving us this is what we want. This is how it's going to benefit the community. This is how it's going to benefit the state. And this is how much it's going to cost, but this is where it's going to be and why it's needed. If we can answer those questions and those questions can be answered, it makes a stronger case for us. Because when we can submit as many requests as we want to the budget office, and the budget office is going to look at it, and they're going to look at it with the House leadership and the Senate leadership, and that's how they're going to decide which projects have priority or which projects are tangible. And the more of those 5 W's and the how that are answered, the stronger that case is going to be. So the directors and the leadership can go, all right, I know this is where this is going. I know this is what it's going to do. This is an easy one, guys. Here we go. Approved.
That's great. And so this is obviously one great success for the mayor and for the representative, just this one trail project. But I know that the representative has also been involved in lots of other trail initiatives and events around the state. And I know that he is a member of the Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus. Can you tell me a little bit more, and that has been running for a few years, can you tell me a little bit more about what a caucus is, why that's important, and what Representative Peralez's experience and impact has been with the caucus?
Yeah, so the Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus, it started last General Assembly. And what's unique about it is that it's a joint legislative caucus. So it's not just the House or just the Senate. It's both chambers working together towards a common goal. A lot of what caucuses will do is when they see legislation that comes up that relates to their subject matter, they'll start lobbying for it. They'll start working with their colleagues saying, hey, we should vote for this, or hey, this is very important. We should support this and we should move it forward. But what the Trails Caucus does that's a little bit different than a lot of caucuses is we leave behind the office building, we leave behind Columbus, and we go to the locations that we're talking about. We go to the trails, we go to the parks, we get the legislators. It's not just the caucus members that are invited. They open up the invitations to the entire legislature, and we say, hey, I know you're not a member of this caucus, but why don't we come show you what we're working on? And then we partner with the local projects. And O'Brien's been instrumental in getting us out in some of there. And honestly, the representative would go to more of them if he didn't have so many knee problems. But it's just about, it's that different atmosphere, taking them out of the office building, taking them out of the cubicles and showing them this is what we're working on. This is why we're asking for these funds. This is what we're supporting. This is why it's important. That's paved the way for a lot of successes for us. We've got some partnerships with our Ohio Department of Natural Resources now, which has opened up the way for citizens to access where these trails are. There's maps, there's programming that they can get involved in. And also last year we were very successful in making sure that we designated 2018 as Ohio's Year of the Trail. So that was a big one for us, a big win. So that both chambers recognized how important this is, not just for the state of Ohio, but for the whole country, so that we can be that beacon that shows, hey, this is how Ohio's getting out in front. This is how we're looking out for our parks. This is how we're looking out for our trails.
Wonderful. And I think that's great. The caucus just seems to have had so many successes, and it's really brought a boost to legislation and initiatives for trails in Ohio. So We've heard from a local elected official, we've heard from state legislative staff, and now I want to turn to one of our advocates in the room. So Brian, I understand you helped sort of get the caucus up and running with the help of the senators and the representatives, and you've also been part of the Ohio Network. Can you tell me more about what the Ohio Network is and why you think it's important?
Sure. Well, first of all, I do want to mention that, we are currently here having an advocacy day. So we're right behind us is the State House, and we scheduled 32 visits. And I cannot emphasize enough what Kevin talked about with building relationships. And those relationships don't just happen with the elected officials, they happen with the legislative aides. I don't know how many times Representative Perales has, got me in touch with Kevin to like sort of triage this, legislation. The year of the trail thing was a bit arduous, but we got through it. And now, moving forward to other things. But back to the Ohio Network, and it kind of segues because it's also about those relationships. It is named such because it's a network of people, and it's a diverse coalition of public health, land trusts, trail advocates. We've got Department of Transportation, Department of Natural Resources, tourism, local elected officials, parks, you name it, business people. And it's also emphasizing our goal to have one trail network that connects up all the trails in Ohio. So given that, one of the things that this coalition has been really good at is being a forum to generate ideas, vet those different issues, and create things like a white paper, which we're using today. And we're talking mostly to newly elected state legislators. We've also put together a legislative agenda in cooperation with the Ohio Trails Partnership. And, just in general, having a multi-regional coalition also means when we advocate, we've got a lot of different perspectives so we can bring constituents to the different district offices or the different districts of those legislators. So, today there's about 10 of us doing those visits. And so we've been able to plug in and highlight. If it's somebody in the Cleveland area, we're talking about protected bike lanes. If it's somebody in Southeast Ohio, we're talking about more recreational trails. So it's been a pretty exciting day, actually.
That's wonderful. I was wondering, what kind of advice would you give to a trail advocate looking to start a similar coalition or a similar network in their state? I think that we've all had those experiences where we tried to put together a coalition and it just kind of didn't work out. What do you think has made yours successful that you would share as advice to other people trying to build a similar coalition?
It's a great question. So I'll mention a couple things. One is cast a wide net. Again, I think that what's been really powerful about this coalition is its diversity. And one of the things that we noticed right away is, having a very kind of focused goal. So many of us have so many meetings every day. If there's not something in it for the particular individual, then it's going to be hard to get them to come to the first meeting and to keep on coming. So we were very focused from the beginning on having this goal to basically connect Ohioans, connect people, places, opportunities, and that really helped. The other thing that's really helped is having this coalition in conjunction with the Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus, which currently we have about 25% of the Ohio State Legislature represented. So very powerful. And, that's part of what's engaging people because we're doing real work. We're actually not just talking and, about our trail woes, but we're actually getting down to business and taking action.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like you have, on the one hand, you have the advocates, and then on the other, you have the legislators and that you're working very closely together. And I think that must make it easier to see and realize the successes and achieve the goals that you want to achieve.
Definitely, yeah. And I really like what Kevin said about just getting people out onto the trail. That's gotten folks even more excited. And every time we have one of those events, we get a new caucus member. We get somebody out who says, this is awesome. And of course, I need to join this effort.
How easy or difficult is that to put on an event? How much work goes into that, and how simple or complicated does it need to be?
I think it's relatively easy. I mean, you think about a district, what's a signature trail? And remember, that can be hiking, biking, water trails. We did one in one of the co-chairs districts, and we did a hike, and then we got in canoes, and we had some hot dogs in between. We ended up in a winery, so we made it a lot of fun. And I think that any kind of event that fits that particular district's profile makes sense. Once people know that state legislators are going to be coming out, you get a lot of people that will want to join in the hike. And I think it's also nice to have those support networks, to have those trail advocates that will help develop that event and get the word out.
So we may have lost the connection with Brian. Are you there?
We can hear you now. We might have lost it for a minute. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Well, thanks so much for that advice. I think that's really, really helpful. And we've heard a lot from Ohio. We've had local successes in the village of Clifton, and we've talked about how that interplays with the state representative, and we've talked about the legislative caucus, and then how the legislative caucus works with the Ohio Network, which is the advocates group. And all of these successes just seem to be combining and snowballing with each other. And so hopefully the folks watching can take some of that away as inspiration for their states. But I also, we've heard about those initiatives. I also want to hear about what's going on in the rest of the country. And Drew, what are some successes that you've seen in the past year from states other than Ohio?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of great stuff happening in Ohio, and so again, I hope that it serves as a useful success story for folks in other states. Just to highlight a couple other things that we worked on last year at the state level. A couple things in California. First was California had a park bond, or sort of park and water bond, and it was Prop 68, I believe, and it was on their June ballot. And this one was in a lot of cases, trails are eligible for funding through park funding. So but we talk a lot about transportation funding, TAP, gas taxes, other things like that. But parks can be a useful and relatively non-controversial way to add funding for trails and other active transportation in the state. So we supported that, and that did pass. And then later in the year, there was an attempt to repeal a transportation initiative. This was Prop 6, and the transportation funding 100 program. So that was something that we really wanted to make sure to protect. So we worked on that to protect that transportation funding, because again, if that had been repealed, it would have cut deeply into California's funding for active transportation. Another state that we're continuing to work in is New York. A few years ago, the governor announced a plan to seek $200 million in funding to complete the Empire State Trail, which crosses the state in two different directions, sort of like a T. And we did support that, and that did pass, but now we're trying to go further and really leverage that as kind of a spine to build out networks that connect to it all across New York State. So we're working with local groups there. We're trying to get a statewide trail plan completed, which will sort of lay the groundwork to really build out these networks and really see that there's a lot of connectivity and to connect different communities throughout the state. I did want to add, Brian and Kevin and Ben all talked about the Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus, but it is something that the caucus model is something we're looking into in a number of states. Brian himself is working in Wisconsin to build up legislative trails caucus there, and there's a few other states we're working on to create these. And they don't necessarily have to be trails. They could be active transportation caucuses. They could be outdoor recreation caucuses. It could be biking and walking caucuses. You sort of decide what works best for your state. And what might have the broadest appeal in what fits your goals. But it does take some work to put them together and to build it, but it can be a powerful tool that's going to have long-lasting benefits. It's not just going to be for one bill, one initiative, but something that can pay dividends for years to come. So, yeah.
Great. And so you mentioned the caucus. The other thing that I heard you mention was the New York State Trail Plan, and I know Ohio has also been working on their state trails plan with the caucus and with the Ohio network. What is, in your opinion, why should an advocate focus on having a state trails plan? What does that mean? I'm trying to get some trail project in my area done. Why should I focus on a state trails plan?
I hope Brian could chime in after me. I think that I was just talking to an advocate in another state, and they were asking me, should we just go try to get some funding now? Or should we try to wait and plan this out better? And I advised them to maybe wait and update their statewide trail plan first so that there was a little bit better sense of priorities and really putting the money in the places where projects are further along in the pipeline. I think it can be useful in pushing for state dedicated funding for trails because you have a roadmap to point to legislators that can say, hey, look, if you pass this dedicated funding, we're not going to be frivolous with it. This project in your district is very far along in the pipeline. It is going to be one of the first to get funding. So it can be useful as a targeting and lobbying tool. But again, I think it's also just useful as a smart to guide smart use of public funds. And the overall cost of them can be, if you can get an agency to agree to use its own operating budget, it can cost effectively nothing. But even if you do have to get an appropriation through the legislature, it's a relatively small amount of money. Brian can speak to how much the cost was in Ohio, but again, I think it's a small investment that can reap bigger benefits in terms of dedicated funding for trails down the line. So the first thing to do would be to check the status of your state trail plan, if there is one at all, and when it was last done. And then if it hasn't been done in a while, or even if it was done recently, is it just an inventory or is it really a good analysis of where things are in the pipeline? Because some of these aren't very sophisticated. So, see what the status is and then go from there.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you to everyone who shared their experiences here. So we've got some great questions coming in from the audience that Drew and I are going to read out. So keep sending them in. Hopefully we can get to all of them in the time that we have left. The first question I'm going to take on, it's someone has asked, do you have examples of successful rail with trail projects with Class 1 railroads that have been completed? If yes, please detail the process. Class 1 railroads, which are some of the larger railroads, we're talking about CSX, BSNF, Union Pacific, some of those folks, those are Class 1 railroads. Their perspective is always that there's a safety issue doing rail with trail. Rails to Trails Conservancy has a report on our website that you can check out. It's a rail with trail report. We do note that the report is a little bit outdated. In the report, it says that there's only been one fatality on a rail with trail, and there's over 100 rail with trail projects. I believe the number is now 2, but both of those fatalities were at an at-grade crossing, which I always like to tell the railroads because they often just don't know these things. So those were at grade. They were at a road crossing. It wasn't anything really to do with the rail with trail. It was just there. In terms of working with them, and I would say, I don't know about rail with trail, but about either like acquiring the railroad, sometimes to do with a rail trail conversion. What I have heard is sometimes railroads, it kind of depends, and it kind of depends on specific people and who's running the department and who's willing to talk to you. I know in the past some railroads have entered into a process where you pick a mutually agreed on assessor to assess the value of the land if you're doing a rail trail conversion. And the theory being that if you both agree on who the assessor is, you'll probably both agree on the amount. And so it'll be easier for negotiations that way. I would say please reach out to us at policy@railstotrails.org, policy@railstotrails.org. If you have other questions about Class 1 railroads, we have an expert in the office. I can certainly forward your email to him. So our next question here is, how should I address my city council's concerns about finding a trail ongoing maintenance cost?
Funding.
Funding a trail's ongoing maintenance cost. So this person already has a grant for the 1.7 mile trail, but the local official is saying, that's great, I'm not sure I want to build it unless we know how we're going to pay for maintenance. So I don't know if either Alex or Brian wants to tackle that one.
Well, yeah, I will say that that question has been raised. It's an important one. It's really important to think about in the overall scope of any project. You know, the post-construction phase. You know, what happens once it's all up and running, and how is it maintained? And one of the things that we've looked at is borrowing some existing models where we're connecting to, there is already you know, groups that are taking care of the maintenance and the upkeep. And so what we want to do is we want to piggyback on that, not reinvent the wheel. But there's a lot of programs out there for adopting trails and groups that get together to address those issues. So Brian, you've worked with the one local group in the Yellow Springs area specifically that we're also partnering with to look at that maintenance. But I would just say that you don't go it alone. What you want to do is you want to work with you know, an existing trail or project's maintenance plan and tag on to that.
Yeah, I'll just add, you know, I think it depends on where you're located, but you know, there are federal dollars for maintenance in some states. It's actually supposed to be in all states, but the recreational trails program has, you know, been traditionally, you know, designed to provide maintenance. Not all states allocate the money that way. Depending on the type of trail, friends groups can certainly help. We've got some amazing friends groups in Northeast Ohio that they do the mowing. They handle, like, you know, stopping the roots from like breaking up if it's a paved trail. If it's a, you know, crushed limestone or more natural trail, it's even, you know, more possible for volunteers to maintain. And then remember, you know, parks and trails levies tend to have maintenance dollars. So, you know, it is kind of jurisdictional dependent, but there are a lot of different options. I will also say state governments are looking more and more at setting up maintenance dollars, because now that we have all this trail on the ground, we need to start advocating for how to keep it, you know, keep the upkeep so that those trail systems are, you know, viable.
Great. Our next question is about applying to TAP, the Federal Transportation Alternatives Program. And they're saying that tracking logistics and cost is quite daunting. Is there any advice on simplifying the process? I would need more information to answer that question completely. If you'd like to send me an email, again, it's policy@railstotrails.org. I would say also reach out to your state transportation alternatives coordinator. They're supposed to be giving advice on this sort of thing. And if they're not, I certainly can help too.
And they would be within the Department of Transportation, right?
The state, yes, the
Right.
State Department of Transportation.
Yeah, whether they have that title or not, there will be somebody who is the coordinator for TAP.
Yes, yeah, there will be. All 50 states have one, and if you're not sure who it is, again, just email me policy@railstotrails.org. So our next question is it worth lobbying state-level representatives supportive of a project to put downward pressure on reluctant local electeds to make a project happen? So if any of you would like to answer that, I'd be interested in hearing the answer.
I think all of you could weigh in on this.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in right away because it's been huge to have Representative Perales and Senator Bob Hackett at the table. So from the very beginning with this Yellow Springs Clifton connector project, which by the way, Alex didn't mention, people have been trying to do it for over 40 years. So I know a lot of people that are listening out there
40, wow.
understand how long these projects take. And one of the things that was a big game changer was having state and local elected officials at the table showing that there was political will. So suddenly some of the agency folks that weren't as excited about the project, to be diplomatic, suddenly became a lot more interested and were at the table. So, yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I second that, Brian, and I would say that just as a local elected official, politicians at any level are obviously open to being influenced, but certainly the downward pressure you mentioned from the State House does hold sway quite a bit with village halls and city halls, and I would say the resolution that was passed at the State House level for the Year of the Trails, that was very instrumental in kind of kicking the conversation off at a local level for us. So it was very important to have Rep. Perales's support, and also some of that kind of momentum already building around us, so that it didn't have to come from us.
Hey, Kevin, what do you think about that question?
I mean, a lot of it's making sure that the leaders are talking to each other, building those relationships and doing whatever you can to make sure that your local leaders and your state leaders, and in many cases it could also be federal leaders, all have a good rapport. I can say that our office has probably one of the best rapports with all of our local leaders, which is always good for us. It's good for them. It's good for you guys to build those networks. So if that means, if it's a new legislator coming in, or it's a new local leader coming in, making sure that you use the networks that you have, use the friendships that you have gained over the years, and get people talking, get people meeting. Because again, it all always starts with someone just bringing it up. So I completely agree with that. That it's definitely a symbiotic relationship.
Great. So our next question is locality specific. The Blue River Trail in Nebraska and Kansas, they connect to each other. How do we educate city and county officials on the importance of trails for residents and tourists? So how do you make the case for a trail connection, basically? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say, if I could, that it's really important to remember that no matter what the mission statement of the group, or if you're talking about local governments, the health, safety, and welfare of the general public, that's always at the center of everything we do. And I think the most important thing to realize as a selling point is that trails really raise the game as far as livability standards. They're the exact opposite of the blighting influence that you have with nuisance areas and those types of zoning problems. Trails are again the exact opposite of that, because what they do is they make people's lives better. They make all of the communities that they connect more interactive at a human level, and that's really important. So in our case, in the Clifton Yellow Springs connector, there is a tourism aspect, especially because our state nature preserve is among the most visited in the state. Our state parks are also visited, and there's a lot of amenities in both villages that visitors coming from outside will appreciate. But I think, and this may be more important, that it's really at the heart of this about connecting local folks from the neighborhoods to their business districts, to the parks, to the amenities throughout their communities in a way that promotes an active lifestyle, so that they don't have to fight traffic and parking every time they want to go visit their state parks, for example.
Yeah, I'll also just add to that. It's very context specific. So, for example, our project, Yellow Springs Clifton Connector, we were initially talking a lot about access, but keep in mind that when nature preserves are involved, access might not resonate with everyone. So you gotta kind of think about, is it about economic development? Is it about health? Is it about environment? Is it about safety? There's different ways to make the case. Alex also brought up the tourism aspect. Well, in my municipality, we have a lot of residents that don't want more tourism. So we, like Alex was saying, focused a lot on the quality of life for our citizens and our community members, which it definitely brings. And so it's definitely, you got to think about who you're talking to and what are the components of the project.
I would just add really briefly that there's a multiplier effect that's really important to understand, that the trails tend to aggregate positive changes that you already have going for you in the community. So if you think of it like a central park or plaza, by itself won't generate any economic activity, but it's going to support and frame all the business district around it, and the public facilities and zoning around that area for the general public. So trails always have that multiplier effect to enhance some of the things that you already have going for you.